4, because we missed last week, so we're 1 week behind. Good and bad questions. Sorry about last week. So what we're going to look at is, what is it about a research question? What are the differences between good and bad research questions? What are some of the philosophical underpinnings to forming a research question? And then the whole area around hypotheses. My hypothesis is, okay, and how do you go about forming a research question? Because that's a key element for determining all of your research is, what is your question? And is it articulated clearly and in a manageable form? Okay. How do you ask a good research question? So, some examples of research questions. What is it you want to have researched? What would you like to explore, realistically or fantastically? What do you want? These are some. Why do men not go to therapy? What makes women choose men who will not meet their needs? How can spending money be addictive? Is shopping addictive? Any other examples? What? So, what kind of questions do you have in mind? What kind of things do you want to have researched? Do you have any ideas about what would be a research question? Or something you want to research? What? What's your question? What are the causes of BME couples not attending therapy? Mm-hmm. No. No. Yeah. Other questions? Other research questions you'd want to research? Why can't they? Why can't people quit chocolate? Yeah? Other questions? Let's be fun. Let's be creative around here. How do single people cope with singledom? Mm-hmm. Huh? Other questions? What burning thing have you always wanted to know about? Doesn't necessarily have to be counseling. Just think about the kinds of people things they want to research. Is the moon made of cheese? Yeah. Doesn't matter. What kind of fantastical questions do you have? Yeah, why do people drink and smoke at the same time? Because it goes together. Why do people drink and smoke at the same time? Because it goes together. Uh-huh. So think about the kinds of questions we're asking here. Okay, are they researchable? Is the question you're asking, in the way you're asking it, does it mean you can research it? Or does your question have to be rephrased? Okay, so think about the questions you've been putting out. Think about the questions might have in mind. Because we're all curious. And that's what research is about. It's about curiosity. Okay? Don't think of research as this arduous thing. Research at the end of the day is about curiosity. What are you curious about? So let's have a quick look at this, if it will work, if we have speakers working.
So, you have to write a research paper. For some of you, this might mean going to Google, typing in your general topic, and using information from the first 2 or 3 results that you find. For others, this might mean trying to find out everything you possibly can about your topic. Unfortunately, neither of these approaches is likely to get great results. To be done right, research needs to be guided by a focused research question. Without a good research question, you will probably end up with a paper that never really comes together because you didn't have a clear direction. But what exactly is a research question? At the most basic, the research question is just a question related to your topic that needs to be answered. The whole purpose of your research will be to provide an answer to the question. You're probably thinking that this doesn't sound too difficult. If a research question is just a question about your topic, it should be easy to come up with one, right? Well, not exactly. For many students, developing a research question is actually one of the hardest parts of the whole research process. In some cases, a student might not know enough about their topic to even understand the kinds of questions that are possible to ask. Even if the student has some knowledge about the topic, they may still not have a good idea of the whole scope of the topic or of recent developments related to that topic. For this reason, it's usually a good idea to try to do some background research before you try to settle on a specific question. This doesn't have to be extensive or time-consuming. For many of you, simply looking at a Wikipedia article or a few recent news articles related to your topic will be enough to give you some ideas for directions that you want to explore. Once you have a bit of background information, you'll be better able to focus your topic into a good research question. But what makes a question a good research question? There are several things that you need to keep in mind. First, a research question should not be too narrow or too broad. If you could answer your question with a few facts, you're not researching, you're just searching. On the other hand, if you would need to write an entire book to appropriately answer your question, then it's probably not a good question for you either, at least at this level. Your question also needs to be specific. Questions such as, is television a bad influence, is very vague. Which television programs are you talking about? What audience are you talking about? What exactly do you mean by bad? Making your question a bit more precise will give you more direction for your research. Research questions should also have some significance. It should be something that interests you, because you will be spending some time with the topic, but it should also be something that other people might find important as well. This doesn't mean that you can't research topics like popular culture or sports or social media. It just means that you need to frame your research in such a way as to make sure the topic is relevant to more than just you. While you want your topic to be significant, you also want to be careful not to ask the types of questions that can't really be answered. Questions such as, why must people suffer, or what happens after we die, are certainly significant to many people, but very difficult to answer. Keep in mind that research papers are not intended to be philosophical treatises. So, as you can see, asking any old question related to your topic won't work. Fortunately, many poor research questions can be transformed into good research questions with only a few tweaks. For example, the question of, why must people suffer, could be transformed into a more focused question, such as, how have major 20th century Christian theologians explained the purpose of human suffering? Finally, you might also want to make your research question a little bit unique or creative. Some topics have already been researched over and over and over, and you might want to avoid those topics if you can. If you do have a common topic, it's often a good idea to try to find a slightly different angle, something that allows you to add your own twist. After all, research should not be about asking questions that have already been answered many times before.
Okay, so that's an overview of research, developing a research question. So let's look at some of those elements in more detail. So basically what they're saying is you can research just about anything as long as it's researchable and you have access to what you want to research and the means to do it. So, again, just remind you of the philosophical structure and the ideas of where you're coming from. So you've got to think of your broad philosophies, where we're coming from and what you're doing. Positivism, realism, interpretivism, pragmatism, and how each of these approaches impacts upon your overall approach and the kind of things that you do at the end of the day. Okay? So in broad terms, qualitative, quantitative, or mixed have different approaches. So constructivism is primarily your qualitative, positivism is primarily your quantitative, and pragmatism is your mixed method where you're doing a bit of both. Okay? So don't get overly caught up in that terminology, constructivism, positivism. It's just a broad philosophical approach that you need to think about. Okay? And they each, if you're taking a particular line, it determines your methodology, your approach to research as a whole. Okay? So in constructivism it becomes qualitative, you're looking at open-ended elements, and you're working with participants. In positivism, where you're looking at that what you measure is real and factual, it's quantitative, it's generally closed, numerical data, and you're working on research subjects. We'll go through that in more detail. So positivism is based on the idea that there is a fixed observable world which you all experience in a similar way, like this lecture boring you to death. Okay? The idea of a fixed, determined world, and there is something happening, we're all experiencing it in exactly the same way. That's positivism. And that's generally linked to what can be deduced from observed facts. So this table is 3 foot by 4 foot, whatever. It's an observable. It's always, if you use that ruler, you will get that measurement. Okay, 3 foot by 4 foot. But if I change my ruler and now it's in 1 meter by 2 meters, is it the same table? Yes. It's just a different measure, but again, an agreed measure becomes what it is. So what's being measured as observable facts has to be agreed upon that this is the unit of measure. It's like temperature. And we could say today is 5 degrees, or we could have said it's 20 degrees, but there's a universally observed thermometer system that's been developed. I mean, here we supposedly use Celsius, but they also always give it to us in Fahrenheit as well. They're both the same temperature, but it's a different measure. So which is the real temperature? It's still chilly. Okay? So, positivist paradigms usually use the quantitative approach. And the crucial concepts in positivism is validity and reliability, the purpose of which is to allow the prediction of an outcome. They establish a cause-effect chain, and we'll talk more about validity and reliability when we come to the quantitative elements. Okay? Because they're important concepts. Does it measure what it purports to measure, and does it measure it reliably each time that it measures it? Is what validity and reliability is about. So constructivism, or phenomenology, is an element within constructivism. We see reality as a multiple constructed subjective reality. Okay? There is no objective reality. This table, to a 5-year-old, is a fort. It's not a table. You know? To a mum, it's a sewing table or a baking shelf. So there's no reality to what the table is. It's a subjective experience of what the table is, rather than the reality of a piece of wood with 4 legs. It's experienced differently. Okay? It's influenced by context and the interaction between the researcher and participant, with the researcher acknowledging and bracketing off their own values that influence their knowing. So we try and suspend and become aware of our values and bias when we're interacting with So think about all your research questions. Why do you want to know those specific topics? What is it about them? And what is your bias in relation to that topic? What is your assumptions about that already? Okay? There's an assumeness that BME couples don't go to therapy. Is that actually true or not? Okay? So one of the key elements that Constructivism uses is phenomenology. Okay? Don't get too caught up. What is phenomenology? Experience. The subjective experience. It's a particular philosophical form of interpreting the world through embodiment, is what it really talks about. And there's numerous forms of phenomenology. And that's where research processes becomes complicated. So you've got an overall approach called Constructivism, within which you have one element called phenomenology. Within phenomenology, you have a variety of approaches: descriptive, hermeneutic, heuristic, and dialogical. They're all phenomenology, but they're each looking at the cake from a different angle or slice again. So if we go back to that, we're looking at interpretivism, it's inductive. You've got ethnography, grounded theory, action. Phenomenology would fall in the grounded theory, ethnography area. There's only so much I can put on a map before it becomes unreadable. But that's the sort of area you're coming from, is from here across. So you'll be looking at these kinds of research processes. Yeah. So the ontological blueprint of interpretive research. What's the ontological blueprint? What's ontology again? What's our knowledge? Knowledge, the basis of knowledge, the basis of knowing is ontology. And paradigm is, how do we know what we know? And phenomenology is a paradigm of knowing how we know. So what we're dealing with is, at this level, is the realm of philosophy. Okay? And it is difficult stuff. There's no two ways about this. Okay? So don't get too caught up on it. But that's the idea of what's used. And then they're talking about new paradigms. Okay? And this is particular in relation to the whole constructivism field. It's really quite a new approach. Because up until now, research has been based on quantitative methods, on positivistic. It's coming from the whole field of rational Newtonian science. The apple falls because of gravity. It falls at a consistent speed. It's measurable. If I drop an apple here or I drop an apple in China, it will fall at the same rate. Okay? The idea that things are measurable and replicable. But the new paradigms when it comes to human experience is they're finding positivistic approaches are not very good for explaining human experience, what we deal with as counselors. We are dealing with the human experience, and measuring that experience tells us what? Very little sometimes, actually. Or it's a sort of, yeah, okay, so you score 8 out of 10 for depression. We know you're depressed. What does it actually tell us? It's meaningless at some level. That number that says you have a depression of 8, what does it give us? Nothing really. We know, okay, 8 out of 10, so it's quite severe, but what more does it tell us? Very little about the person's experience of being depressed at a number 8. And that's where the new paradigms come in. It's to process human experience as the center of inquiry and to understand the effects that any measuring experience has. So if I ask somebody to measure their depression and they come up with 8, what does that mean to them? How have we influenced their experience of depression. When they see it's 8 out of 10, oh, I must be really depressed. When they might have beforehand not thought they were that depressed. Yeah, it might make the depression worse. So we're seeing those who are being researched as decision makers, as involved in the process. They're people rather than subjects. Okay? So the new paradigms approaches the traditional positivistic approaches and criticizes them for the following reasons. Traditional methods tend to be rationalistic, assuming that human experience is a result of logic decision making. Okay? A rational methodology is applied to irrational experience, do not offer us meaningful explanations. It masks the true nature of the irrational experience. So we get a measure of X, of anxiety or whatever. It doesn't tell us much about that experience. The scale itself imposes meaning. So how depressed are you? How anxious are you? The person might say, I'm a bit anxious, but when they score, oh no, I'm really anxious, it might make them worse or might make them better. So you have to realize that the process of measuring something has an impact on that thing. Any idea what that effect is called? There's a name that is used in science to describe the process of measuring something. Hawthorne effect. Okay? It was discovered at a factory during the Second World War, where they wanted to improve production, and they had men in white coats go and look at the production line to see what were the bottlenecks. And as a result, production went up. But they hadn't changed anything. These were just guys at particular points in the factory looking at what was going on, and production went up. And they went away and production went down. The very act of measuring the production had had an impact, even though they had changed nothing. Okay? So the process of measuring has an impact, and that has to be taken into account. Think of yourself and you're going down the street and somebody pounces on you with a clipboard. Okay? Or you realize that there's somebody there measuring, watching. Your behavior changes. You become conscious. So the process of measuring alters the very thing that's being measured. So are we measuring the thing we wanted to measure after all? If we've changed it. And hence, positivistic measurement on human nature isn't meaningful in the long run. Okay? We end up doing self-fulfilling prophecies. So there's an oversimplistic rational view that people know one thing, believe another thing, and yet do a third thing. How do we make sense of that? And we ask the wrong questions in the wrong way and come up with oversimplistic rational answers. So why do people still smoke? We know that smoking is bad for your health. They believe that I'll get away with it, and they continue smoking. It won't happen to me. Yet the evidence all points, if you smoke, you'll get cancer. So how do we make sense of that behavior? You think every teenager today wouldn't smoke, given the clear evidence that smoking causes cancer. But smoking amongst teenagers hasn't gone down. So, in the new paradigm, there's no illusion that there's one objective truth to be discovered. There's no certain knowledge. Okay? There's no absolute truth anymore. Which is quite scary if you think about it. There's an acceptance that no one method or methodology is supreme. There are many tools, and the choice depends on the nature of the question and the form in which the answer is desired. How you ask your question determines what knowledge you gather. So we could measure anxiety looking at blood pressure, skin galvanization test, an EEG, and we'll get physiological measures of anxiety. That will give us one measure. But again, the experience of the anxiety and a description of what's going on, and the person saying where they are on a scale will give you a very different measure. Both are accurate, but both give you different information about the same experience, the same thing. Okay. So it depends on your question and what are you wanting to have answered. So if you're wanting to know what is the physiological effect of anxiety, then you'll take those tests. But if you want to know the subjective experience of being anxious, you won't necessarily take those tests. Intuition and imagination are valued, so you're also working from your experience and your interaction with the participants, and as that informs you, you go forward. And the notion that the subject of research are replaced by the concepts of they are co-researchers or participants rather than subjects. So we don't refer to people who are taking part in research as subjects anymore. They are now participants, to emphasize the idea of co-construction of reality. Okay, so that's the philosophical elements. That we are moving, particularly in counseling research, to the interpretivist world of subjective experience, and we're constructing and interpreting reality with our research subjects, participants. But all research operates from, or used to operate from, the idea of hypotheses and questions. So what is a hypothesis? Your hypothesis is your statement about what you are researching. It's a statement about your research area or topic. And this is fine in classical research, quantitative research. So a hypothesis is a supposition or an idea made on the basis of limited evidence as a starting point for further investigation. Okay, water is wet. What makes water wet? It might be where you're beginning. Or simple terms, a proposal intended to explain certain facts or observations. So you've seen something, you observed, you've got a gut feel, you've got an idea. My hypothesis is the dinosaurs all died of malnutrition because the plants had died. Or whatever it might be. There will be, you have an idea based on. Okay? So to use one of my papers was that affairs in marriage have a functional role, okay? Rather than being an outside thing that happens. There's a function to an affair. That was my hypothesis. That affairs have a function within a marriage, a homeostatic function within a marriage. No, that was my hypothesis. Okay? But depending on how you approach that, you can get various answers to that question, that hypothesis. Okay? So that's what I had. I had numerous number of accounts where affairs were taking place. I began looking at, well, what is the function of the affair rather than the impact? If I want to look at the impact, I could take in measures of distress and whatever, or I looked at it from a systemic perspective. And what role does it play in the life cycle of a marriage? Because you do know 60% of all long-term relationships will have an affair in the course of its lifetime. Sorry to disappoint you. 60%, yeah. Of all long-term relationships will have an affair of some form in the course of its lifetime. So don't give up on your marriage just because your partner has slept around. Yes, 40% are lying. So a hypothesis that holds up after testing accrues a degree of certainty and probability that it's true, and that becomes a theory. Okay, so we test the hypothesis, find that it's proven, we can now begin to rely on that as a fact. That's from the positivistic framework, remember. Okay? This is known as the hypothetico-deductive method. Just somebody being complex with their words. Okay? In this approach, the problem is never asked as a question, but stated as a hypothesis, a simple statement of belief that some aspect of the world is yet unknown. It involves a prediction that something will happen if tested. So you're trying to predict if something will happen with a hypothesis. In your research, your question becomes a hypothesis. So the example in the book is, what is the moon made of? We don't know. You've got to put forward the idea you have about the moon. The moon is made of green cheese. Okay? And that becomes your hypothesis. So it moves from a question to a statement. So can you formulate your questions you were all asking earlier into a statement? People who drink will smoke at the same time. So it's turning it into a statement. That drinking, the use of alcohol will encourage the use of cigarettes. Okay? Or it might be the drinking in a pub will result in participants smoking. Well, not anymore because of the smoking laws. So, we state the hypothesis because it simplifies it down to more manageable size. You know, what is the moon made of? It's too vague. Why do people smoke? It's too broad. Why do people smoke when they're at the pub? People will smoke when they go to the pub. Becomes a more manageable research question. So, all these research questions that you proposed or we thought about have to be broken down into more manageable chunks to bring it to a sizable element. And by forming a hypothesis, we can use various statistical procedures to either prove it or disprove it. Okay? Your hypothesis is never called true, it's proved or disproved. Because it's only a hypothesis. But we have to find the right hypothesis, because if your hypothesis is disproved, well then what is the moon made up? If it's not made up of green cheese, is it made up of mozzarella? Maybe it's marzipan. Okay? And then you keep going on that sort of thing.
So your question no longer becomes a question,
A statement. Yeah. So you turn your research question into a statement. And then it goes on to the next part. Your research question also has to have a null hypothesis. Okay, and this is where people get a lot of confusion between the hypothesis and null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is a general statement or default position that there is no relationship between the two measured phenomena, or no association. So to use the pub example, people drinking the pub will not smoke more, will not smoke. People who go to the pub will not smoke. You turn it on its opposite end, in a sense, that there isn't a relationship. People going to the pub will smoke, is your research hypothesis. The null hypothesis, people going to the pub will not smoke. Because you disprove the null hypothesis rather than your hypothesis. Okay? Rejecting or disproving the null hypothesis that you're saying there is no relationship between these two elements, saying that is false, means you've proved your hypothesis. It's too easy for researchers to prove their hypotheses through a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you always try to disprove your null hypothesis. So BME couples do not go to therapy. You know, BME couples go to therapy. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So let's see if this link works out briefly. It's not a complete. This gives you an idea. It's not a complete video because it cuts off.
A hypothesis is a speculation or theory based on insufficient evidence that lends itself to further testing and experimentation. With further testing, a hypothesis can usually be proven true or false. Let's look at an example. Little Susie speculates or hypothesizes that the flowers she waters with club soda will grow faster than flowers she waters with plain water. She waters each plant daily for a month, experiment, and proves her hypothesis true. A null hypothesis is a hypothesis that says there is no statistical significance between the two variables in the hypothesis. It is the hypothesis that the researcher is trying to disprove. In the example, Susie's null hypothesis would be something like this. There is no statistically significant relationship between the type of water I feed the flowers and growth of the flowers. A researcher is challenged by the null hypothesis and usually wants to disprove it to demonstrate that there is a statistically significant relationship between the two variables in the hypothesis. An alternative hypothesis simply is the inverse or opposite of the null hypothesis. So if we continue with the above example, the alternative hypothesis would be that there is indeed a statistically significant relationship between what type of water the flower plant is fed and growth. More specifically, here would be the null and alternative hypothesis for Susie's study. Null, if one plant is fed club soda for 1 month and another plant is fed plain water, there will be no difference in growth between the two plants. Alternative, if one plant is fed club soda for 1 month and another plant is fed plain water, the
It cuts over that point. But you get the idea. Okay? So you're trying to always disprove the null hypothesis. But how useful is a hypothesis when we're looking at subjective experience and trying to do a statistical relationship analysis? You know, really raises lots of questions on my part around that. So HO is for your hypothesis, H1 is for the null hypothesis. So in this example, or the alternative hypothesis, aliens have stolen my socks. Okay? So there is a relationship between drugs and placebo, or there isn't a relationship between drugs and placebo. You know? So those are the various kinds of ways people write the null hypothesis. Okay. So this is to safeguard against the tendencies for researchers to prove their hypothesis, because you can quite easily set out to prove your hypothesis. People go to the pub and smoke. See, there's 20 people in the pub, 10 are smoking. It only takes one instance of a hypothesis failing for it to be disproved. To establish a hypothesis that is universally true requires the examination of every possible case in which it applies. Always has to be true. All swans are white. All swans are white, aren't they? Well, up until the 18th century, before Australia was found, all swans were white. All swans in the northern hemisphere are white, all swans in the southern hemisphere are black. Yeah, got a tan. I don't know why, genetics, whatever. Okay? So no number of sightings of white swans can prove the theory that all swans are white. The sighting of just one black swan can disprove it. That's the problem with hypotheses. You only require one incidence for it to be thrown out. And hence, a hypothesis remains a hypothesis. It remains approved or disproved. It's never true. It's proved whilst nothing disproves it. Okay? So, a hypothesis, it can be tested, it's verifiable or falsifiable. We'll come back to that later in quantitative. They're not moral or ethical questions that you're asking. They can't be put to a hypothesis. Is God good? Or why does God let good people suffer? Is not a hypothesis. You can't investigate that. Okay? It's neither too specific nor too general. It's a prediction of consequences, and it's considered valuable even if proven false. Why is it valuable if proven false? If you disprove the hypothesis, you still got some element of research saying, yeah, okay, so we know that this doesn't work. Hitting your clients with a 2x4 doesn't improve therapy attendance. So, in qualitative research, then there's a very different approach. Okay? The qualitative is a hypothesis-generating research. You are generally working from a broad area to create an idea, rather than going from an idea and proving it. You're working in a sense in reverse often. The hypothesis-generating research allows the researcher to begin a study without having to test a hypothesis. And you develop a hypothesis by listening to what the research participants have had to say. So, what is the experience of anxiety? You gather the information. You can then say, people experiencing anxiety struggle with the following elements. X, Y, Z. Okay? So you're developing a hypothesis after data is collected. So you're interpreting. It's hypothesis generating research rather than hypothesis testing. So you're forming an idea rather than checking out the idea. So it's the opposite sort of route. I just said that. So what are good questions and what are bad questions? This is a key element in any research. How you phrase your research questions determine the key elements. If you ask a question, you need to determine what kind of answer would it give you. And will that answer actually answer the research question? Okay. So think about your research questions you pose. What kind of answer would that give you? Is it numbers? Is it words? Is it a description? Is it an experience? Okay. That's what I mean by what kind of answer. Is it a qualitative answer or a quantitative answer? Will that kind of answer what you're looking for? If not, you need to change your question for what you're wanting to know. Yeah? So, you ask questions that generate answers that give you numbers will generally be quantitative research. How many women are in abusive relationships in numbers? So you hand out a questionnaire. Are you in an abusive relationship? Yes, no. If yes, how many abusive relationships have you been in? You're gathering quantitative data. Or if you ask questions that generate explanations or descriptions, you'll be doing qualitative, where you're interpreting the answer. What do women in abusive relationships experience? It'll be very different. You're dealing with the same thing, but you're getting a very different picture. You can mix them both together. How many and what do they experience will be a mixed method approach. Okay. And how you phrase your question will determine whether it's researchable or not. Okay. So, an example, why are social networking sites harmful? It's too vague. Okay. Harmful is vague. Which social networking sites? What of them? Okay. A better question, how do privacy policies affect users on Facebook and Twitter? Okay. And this is where, when you begin to develop your research question, particularly going to level 5 in the research methods 2 and for your dissertation, this is what, as lecturers, we're going to be doing to your question all the time. We're trying to make it a good question. Not that we're against you, even though that's what it will feel like. We're trying to help you hone what are you actually wanting to research, what you're actually wanting to find out. Okay? So, some characteristics of good research questions. It's grounded in generally a theoretical framework. It builds on previous research. It has suggestion for further research. It's something you're sincerely interested in because you're going to be spending a lot of time on your research project, so be interested in your subject. Don't do something that you just can't stand because you won't get it finished. Okay? It addresses a real world problem. You need to consider the ethics. Look at the variables. There's multiple possible questions that you can use. The purpose should be to drive the study design. The research study design is what it generates. Your research question determines your methodology. Okay. So some other elements you've got to think about good research questions are they clearly defined? Are they feasible? Will the people answer them? Can you have access to those people? So a lot of you want to do X, Y, and Z. Do you have access to those people? I want to work with deaf people and therapy. How do they experience therapy? Do you have access to deaf people in therapy? If not, you're not going to get it answered. Okay? So those kind of things. The questions you're asking should be clear enough to be understood by a 12-year-old or readers of the Sun newspaper. Don't load a single question with lots of sub-questions. Okay, so don't go, are you interested in Liverpool winning the league? And if they do win the league, hang on, one question, then another question. No sub-questions. You know. Is it ethical and not unnecessarily personal? So you might have a personal engagement, abuse victims because you were abused, but it mustn't be overly personal because you won't see the wood for the trees. Is it interesting enough for people to want to answer it and get engaged in it? Who is your target market? Is it Liverpool fans or Arsenal fans? You know? You're asking an Arsenal fan about how they feel about Liverpool winning the cup. So, but it might, depending on what your research question is. Okay? Do not lead the participant responding by giving them an answer in the question. This is those self-fulfilling answers, rhetorical questions. Is water wet? Okay. Running a bit out of time. So this is the paper that I've put up. Have a look at that as a beginning point. Read it broadly. You don't need to go into too much detail on it, but it gives you a starting point about thinking around choosing a research question. That is the author. Okay? It's a journey to a research question. You don't get it overnight. It doesn't appear instantly. And you need to think about it in a careful way. And some of the key elements that she finds is what's inspiring you? Why do you want to do this area? Okay? Important element. What's the gap in the literature is really what you're looking at, particularly in later on research when you're considering doing your doctorates. What inspires you? So draw up a mind map around this and think about where it's coming from. So these are from the reading. You need to be reflexive about this. Why is it pulling you in? And what is your bias about the subject? Because if you don't identify that, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot. Refine the scope, and as she says, she gives 4 lenses to achieve a researchable question. Time, place, person, benefits and applications, pragmatics and ethics, and originality contribution. Those are the 4 elements where she gives examples in the book. And this is the true cycle of developing a research question. It's an ongoing process that influences you. You read some literature, you begin thinking of your research area, you're reflecting on it, it refines your research area, you go back to the literature, you form a question, but that question again will be influenced by further literature or further investigation, and you'll refine your question even further. Okay? Be aware that you'll be refining your question at least a dozen times before you get down to your research dissertation question. But you need to focus in on an area down the line so that you'll be there. Okay. So have a look at the section that we've covered today. 2 2.1, asking questions, Caskett's choosing research question, and a reading that was on qualitative hypothesis generating research. I found quite an interesting article on that, and that's the name of the author that they had on it. The Yeshiva University Fatherhood Project. And that's very true. You wait for inspiration. Okay. So that's good question.